So for our talk today, we'll be hearing from Will and Jenna. So yes, it's me.
Yes, thank you. All right, everyone, I know you're just thrilled to see me again. Here we go. We have to apologize to start. We had, in fact, two different speakers for this opportunity that from the outside who do amazing work who weren't able to make it. We're going to hope to have them in the future. But nonetheless, Jen and I are very well versed in this area and are very excited to present this idea to you today. So the way we always are going to structure this, just to remind you, is the thread through the semester is Greenleaf's idea of servant leadership and the different elements of that. And then each time Jen and I would start off regardless to kind of unpack that with each other and give you a framework to understand the speaker. And the speaker will bring some valuable example of that, right? And it might be a movement, it might be a philosophy or an idea, it might be an organization or a person or a time in history. But that'll be enfleshing kind of the parallel to this Greenleaf idea. So as we've discussed, like the first idea that we're going to be getting into today is to really unpack prophetic, right? So all I'm here is just to remind you guys of what his definition of that was, because it's very important that we're going to try to maintain that language that's established, and always kind of, by establishing a common language, we can kind of build off of that and make ties back to it each time we explore different issues and topics. So just as a reminder, does anyone want to read that the definition, or as Greenleaf understands it? Shall I do it? Okay, can we do it? Yes.
Okay, sure.
I'll just hold that. Go ahead.
Okay. Although separate from a leader, but indispensable to her or him, the prophet is one who has the ideas, which, if implemented, will create the means for healing.
Okay, so that was one of the key things about it that we wanted to establish, is that idea of healing. And going back to some of the terms of what a servant leader does. Do you guys remember from last time what the nature of a servant leader is and what the nature of like a religious service leader is? What do they do? Remember that? Anyone? Billy?
They act as sort of they set an example, but at the same time are servants themselves, moving everyone else forward in a new direction.
Okay, exactly. Good, very good. So the servant leader really is an example and is an inversion of our normal definition of a leader, in that they're putting others and the larger community, the larger whole first. And that's what kind of defines what it makes it a different notion, different than our popular world's notion of what a leader is, right? And it takes it and elevates it because it happens to be particularly successful at doing what? Does anyone remember what the word religious means at its root, religio? Does anyone remember that? To rebind, exactly. So that the nature of a servant leader, especially in a religious context, but in any context, is to rebind, to take those disparate parts that each of us human beings are and to remind us of how we are really one whole. And it's in that whole that our greater identity, our greater fulfillment, our greater talent, creativity, and capacity is kind of realized. So with that, we're going to turn over to Jenna, who's going to unpack the term prophetic a little bit, according to Greenleaf, what the elements of being prophetic are about.
Thank you. So kind of looking at the idea of Greenleaf's account of prophetic, we wanted to pull three things out today to really focus on and kind of weave through our discussion of liberation theology and the people who are really important in it. The first thing is the idea of being prophetic is being creative, imaginative, and new. It's not just like saying the same old thing that everybody's been saying. You're coming with a new approach to an idea. And the idea of being creative within that role is really important for two reasons. One, because again, it's the idea of being new, but also because of what creative means. Like you're literally creating something, you're constructing something, and then going back to that idea of the spirit of a prophet that Greenleaf was talking about, the spirit of a servant leader. What you're creating and what's new, what you're constructing, is an outward movement in service to others. So that's a huge part of being prophetic, is that you're announcing a new way of being in relationship and engaging the world around you. And creative becomes really interesting in the role of liberation theology, in the role of being prophetic, because it also has to do with imagination. It's your ability to look at the world around you and say it shouldn't be this way, and I can see another way that I think it should be. And that leads to concrete action. The next point that is really emphasized in there is the idea of countercultural. A lot of times when you're putting out a new way of being that says something about the current way that things are, so you're offering something over and against. It's a critique of the present in terms of the systems, structures, and values. And then going back to what Greenleaf is saying, oftentimes those systems, structures, and values are things that put forward the self-interest of individuals. So it's systems, structures, and values that are part of a very alienated culture that you're acting in opposition to. But systems, values, and structures don't just stand in thin air by themselves. They're supported by people and people who benefit from them. And so the countercultural message is often met in response by conflict, because people don't like to be unseated and they don't like to be told that they're wrong. And so the conflict that comes into play is not just interpersonal conflict or intergroup conflict or international conflict, but it's the conflict between a way of looking at the world that's grounded in principles of self-interest and alienation, or a way looking at the world that's grounded in principles of a spirit of service, a whole mentality, and a communal identity.
Thank you. All right. Okay, we'll be heading to the next page now. But my chi flows best when I stand up, so I have to kind of move around. I know it might be distracting, but okay. So we revisited some of those ideas that are hopefully percolating in your mind over the last couple weeks, right? The idea of what it means to rebind, why service is so important, and really the lens and insight into the world that it gives us, right? Of the interconnectedness of all of life and the deeper value in going away that affirms that. And there's a unitive principle. So the servant leader is one that is bringing people and things together in a creative way that binds them in a meaningful way. And that can be transformational, because much the way of the world, kind of the entropy, if you will, is for things to sometimes degrade down into the lowest common denominator, our individual selves, the realization of just thinking that we're very separate and so forth. Now, Jenna and I were talking, we were thinking about what would be a great example to talk about to demonstrate this prophetic nature, especially these three elements, and what would be kind of a core thing that we'd want you to have some familiarity with before you left Villanova. So assuming, your curriculum, maybe even as an engineer or nurse, is jam-packed, what are the things that we feel are pretty essential that you're exposed to? So today we're going to unpack a little bit about liberation theology as an example of this prophetic movement, dynamic, and so forth. It's going to be a cursory introduction. This is scratching the surface of something that's very powerful and really quite remarkable in the history of our church and our world. But with that, I want to give you some historical context for it. So the time frame in which a lot of this movement emerges is in this post-World War II world, where the greater globe is being decolonized. So much of Europe was sort of had the rest of the world, developing world, as colonies. They were divesting of those colonies, leaving a power vacuum. And in that power vacuum, you had anything from corrupt dictators and oppressive dictators surfacing, to chaos, to a lot of social issues that started to get even worse by a lack of structure and leadership. So social issues like poverty or health or education or conflict start to come to a simmer, if not boil, by the end of this period. So where a lot of this starts to brew in particular and start to peek its head out in an overt way is in the 60s. And a lot of what we're going to talk about and the people that we're going to talk about run straight through into the 80s even. So we're going to get into some key terms, but again, think about the world at that time. So globally, this is what's going on socially, politically, economically. In the United States, you've got the civil rights movement, so a new awakening of the rights and dignity of human beings and addressing a lot of our own social sins in racism and prejudice, and classism even. The Catholic Church in particular at this time is coming out of a time of being really insulated and is emerging into a relationship with the modern world. So in the 60s, Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council comes about, and it is a complete reformation of the Catholic Church and its relationship. It then becomes more proactive in its relationship and presence in the world, and a lot of very powerful social doctrines come out of this. A lot of very powerful doctrines empowering and talking about the laity and the nature of the body of Christ being the faithful and the human family in general. Very, very powerful ideas are moving. In particular, in Latin America, a lot of things that are happening on the ground at that time lead to a particular conference in Medellin, Colombia. And that's really where a lot of the terms that we're going to unpack here start to take shape or even emerge. But what's important in giving you a specific background on how this comes about is important to know, like, okay, what's going on historically, what's going on the ground. So I use two test cases in particular. El Salvador and Nicaragua are some of the very worst atrocities that are taking place. There's the most conflict, unrest, violence, turmoil, you name it, is going on in this period. Because you have dictatorial regimes that are highly oppressive to the people, and particularly the poor. There is a great deal of violence. People are disappeared quite often, and this happens more and more as we emerge into the latter half of the 20th century. There's, going back to like why Vatican II and the civil rights are taking place, there's a social consciousness that starts to emerge amongst the human society, right? So Gutierrez refers to this as an explosion of the poor. Like, not only is the context right, but all of a sudden there's enough social science and media and technology for us to really be aware of what's going on in the world, and that the poor have access to this in some way where they begin to realize their own rights or their own diminishment in this structure. They start to begin to understand their own oppression. Particularly in Latin America is where we're going to be focusing on this. So out of this, you find a lot of base communities start to gather. People start to talk. They try to find a way to support each other when they don't know day to day what they might be eating, or the next day, maybe the corrupt government police or army might come through and really exploit the village for something. There's a lot of instability and uncertainty. So the communities start coming together and talking. They refer to these as base communities much of the time because they're trying to find a way of talking about this but also emerging from it. And I'm giving a huge glossing over many of the details here. But this also happens within churches, because one of the key social institutions and structures that exists in this region of the world, especially when there's sort of a weak government system or a vacuum of actually a government that's benefiting its people, is the church, right? The church is this institution that's been around for millennia, and it also, in living out its mission, is really active in the social services, in providing for people's needs. So in this context, people are having conversations. And as Gutierrez starts to see, like there's a spirit starts to move. Before I go into some more specifics about that, does anyone else want to contribute to the context that we're laying out here? Does anyone know anything else you think is really vital to explain about Latin America and what's going on at that time? Caitlin?
Yeah, it's just kind of Lauren. We went to El Salvador together last winter.
Would you like a little bit? Yeah,
Uh,
that's all right.
So Lauren and I went to El Salvador together last winter, and we learned a lot about Oscar Romero and the communities that were affected by the violence in El Salvador. I don't know. Did I say it?
You want to say something? Is it your turn? Okay. Go from the hip.
Yeah, we learned. Oh, this is weird. We actually were able to go to the site where, like it mentions on here, where the woman, we didn't go to where the women martyrs were killed, but we went to where the 6 Jesuit priests were murdered, which was a very powerful experience. And like they were murdered at the UCA, the University of Central America, which was constructed for the poor and to educate them. So it's directly like related to this explosion in the social consciousness, because the Jesuit priests constructed this church or this university to instruct people on how the poor were being oppressed, and then the government came in and murdered these Jesuit priests. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so those are some just concrete examples to give you a little bit more of an overview. Of course, in El Salvador, that's where Archbishop Oscar Romero is going to start to speak out on behalf of the poor when the violence is really getting out of hand and just crossing a huge line, and he's martyred. We're going to discuss him a little bit further later. As Lauren was saying, there were Jesuit scholars at the University of Central America that began to get together and were writing and speaking and teaching in ways that were empowering to the poor, but the vulnerable and the marginalized, right? There's a gospel theme behind what they're doing that we're going to unpack a little bit more here. Other particular players that are really important, John Sobrino, who is a leading scholar and theologian, Jesuit priest at the UCA. Jenna's really going to get into a lot of the things that he says that are really challenging and important. Fernando and Ernesto Cardinal, 2 priests who in particular, in their support of the people, end up finding themselves called to be a part of the revolutionary government, the Sandinista government that overthrew Somoza, a dictator at the time. So there's a lot of really things that are starting to get complicated here, and it's difficult. You can see where there's a lot of controversy going on. We're going to get more into that. I'm kind of spotting all over history to give you a feel for it. The timeline's too large to explore in full, but these are some key characters and figures. Lauren and Caitlin talked about the Jesuit priests, and there are also church women, some nuns, some lay women who were all murdered just for working in service to the poor community. They were doing nothing political besides really attending to people's needs, and if those people happened to be speaking out, then they were aligned with them, and they were all brutally murdered. They're American, so a lot of the attention tends to go to that in our end, but tens of thousands are killed and disappeared at this time. So one particular figure I want to talk about a little more, who was more or less the founder of liberation theology in its concrete term, is Gustavo Gutierrez. And I'm going to tell a little bit of his story, his life, because I had the privilege of being able to study with him in grad school. And just to be able to tell his story, I'll give you a little more of the feel of where this is coming from. So he himself is Peruvian, and he grew up early on in his adolescence. He came down with a pretty debilitating illness. He was bedridden through most of his teens. So he started to read, and he really developed his intellectual capacities in his heart and his faith life at that time. Brilliant, decides to become a priest, ends up going on and studying in Europe, Louvain, and other places, but also becomes one of the more educated individuals in Central American church at the time, and is invited into these church conferences. So he's at Vatican II, he's at Medellin, he's at these places where these larger conversations are taking place. And at the same time, he was called to be a priest, not for a lot of these academic or intellectual reasons, but for very pastoral reasons, for a love of people, for a love of God, a love of the poor. And the key thing that really struck me about him is he talked about what got him on this journey, and it was this pastoral problem. Here he is, a priest in Lima, a city of millions of people, in one of, if not the most poor barrio there was, and he has this expectation that he has to preach and announce the gospel to the poor. He has to look them in the eye and tell them that God loves them, even though their lives are the exact opposite of that in their day-to-day living. And he doesn't quite know how to do that. So he goes back and he tries to formulate, this is really condensing this, but more or less part of the solution was to come up with a new way to announce this gospel. So he goes back to, he actually starts, liberation theology is actually more of a method of doing theology. And I don't want to get too much into the details of it, but it is important to identify that because there's something prophetic about the way you even do theology, which is just talking about God. And that is broken down here. It's a critical reflection on praxis in light of faith. So we're going to think critically about what's going on, about the movement of the Spirit in the world, in the base communities, in the faith-filled people who are actually standing up and acting and living out their faith. In reflection of that, in light of faith. So faith is not just the personal nature of it with God, but it's also this tradition, especially in the Catholic Church. It's scripture and tradition. So we have our scriptures, but also all this compilation of wisdom through the ages. And there's a conversation that goes on between these things. But what's really unique about this is that reflecting on the circumstances of the time and trying to find out how to communicate this gospel message, it's a new time period. And no one's really thought about the fact that being poor has a new way of being looked at. The social sciences have developed to the point where we now understand social phenomena, socioeconomic and political phenomena, that there are actual causes to poverty. And so if we're really going to critically reflect on what's going on, we have to use everything at our disposal to understand that. And we have to take the core of the gospel message and apply it with that knowledge. So what does that mean? If there's causes to poverty that we can pinpoint, then we have a responsibility to address those causes, okay? But what's most key, one of the key things about liberation theology, most people might think of it as like its own philosophy or its own set of way of reading Christianity, and it is. But in particular, it acknowledges there's room for other things. But the new theology that Father Gutierrez was doing is coming up through the Spirit in the people and what's going on in the time period. Okay, it's understanding and reading the signs of the times there. And so there's Latin American liberation theology, right? As to quote to him, is a Latin American reflection on being poor Christians. Because this new way of doing things is looking at your context of what's going on now, where the Spirit is now. And much of Vatican II and the very Eurocentric Catholic Church doesn't really look at those things outside of that world at this point. No one's speaking on behalf of that Latin American world and about their experience in it, and about how God is still in the midst of all this suffering. Well, the new way of doing this is really fairly revolutionary. So it's taking different parts and synthesizing them together, but in ways that Jenna will explain, it's kind of taking some of the central control over what theology is away from the institutional church in some ways. It's in dialogue with it, but it's not always strictly of it alone. And the key thing is that there is no neutral theology outside of history. So the way we understand our faith and the way we talk about God, it's always about how that living God and that this Holy Spirit is alive in history, in the things that are happening right now in a concrete way that are very real to us. It's not abstract. It's not abstract to the point where it has nothing to do with your here and now. It must, if it's real talking about God, if it's a real theology, it must always have something to do with your here and now. God is a right now God. God is a living God. That's what that term means. Okay? So one of the largest contributions in terms that comes out of this way of thinking is how do I preach and proclaim the gospel, the good news that God loves you, to the poor, goes back and looks at it. And there's something called the term is used, the preferential option for the poor. And it's a hermeneutical key. Does anyone know what a hermeneutic is? Philosophy major? It goes from the Greek term Hermes and messenger. It's basically, in order to read something that took place thousands of years ago, how do you understand what they really meant? And hermeneutics is the study of, okay, how can we figure out what they really meant? So he's going back, and he's looking at the fact that Jesus has God revealed in Jesus' life. It's a very, very special relationship with the poor and vulnerable, right? Everything is always sort of leading towards and with the poor and most vulnerable. That's who God seems to gravitate towards the most. So God is revealed and found in human relationships, but mostly and especially in the most vulnerable. Now, this is going to be really key, and this is going to be very challenging, as Jen is going to help elucidate later. But what this means also is then, even on a social scale, that society itself and the preferential option for the poor means that every decision, personal or societal, must take into account how it impacts the most vulnerable, the marginalized, and the poor. And this is the solution. Or the proposed solution. This is how he's going to be able to actually communicate the fact that God loves the poor of his barrio, his faithful who are suffering and struggling and don't understand why and might not fully understand where God is. It's to go back and to look at the fact that Jesus is always about the poor. He is always on your side. Take hope, have hope, take faith. God is with you. And you can say it definitively because the preferential option for the poor is the way that God operates in this world. And so that is the hermeneutic is the way that you're going to look at how everything operates. A preferential option for the poor. So where does the term liberation come in, right? Well, historically, a lot of spiritual liberation and salvation tends to be a really interior thing, right? It's the monk living in the monastery praying. It's the solitary saint giving charity. It's an individual model of holiness. But with this new understanding of human beings and a new understanding, a modern understanding of societal and sociological causes of human society and human culture, it adds that other layer of what it means to be human. So to be wholly human is to be mind and body and soul. And if there's nothing that we can take from the Christian message is that all of you matters. Mind, body, and soul to the God Jesus matters. And if that matters, then your liberation, your freedom has to do with all of those dimensions that make you human. And to really sum it up, and this is a key term that really reflects back into what we're trying to unpack with Greenleaf, is liberation means free to love. Now that's very simple and it's very dense and powerful because it's a freedom to ultimately be who we are, to be image and likeness of God, to be in communion with God that is love, right? To be a part of the whole. To be free to love means to be free to be a part of that whole and to live in recognition of that and to be animated by the spirit of that interconnected relationship that is sacred. And God and Christ are concerned with the whole person. Society has to be concerned with the whole person. Some of us, this might sound like common sense, but this conversation hasn't really been had yet at this level in the later 20th century. It's just starting to take a really powerful shape and a really prophetic form in its own time. But importantly, it's also freedom from anything that denies and diminishes human dignity or inhibits one's relationship with God or fulfillment of our human potential. So as you can see from the outline, one thing that Father Gutierrez comes back to, and many of the criticisms you'll hear later, is that this is so urgent and it's so active and it's so communal that it's just theology for communists, right? But the source of this for Father Gutierrez is actually radically orthodox in the way that it's about the Eucharistic table. It's about everyone has a seat at that table, and Jesus' love and Christ's love for all as a reflection of God's presence in our lives and God's message. So, as a part of that, sin is always a part of that obstacle. We can never forget that. Our own fulfillment, that's the one that's been focused on mainly through the history of the church, but sin, it's your own personal dimension. Oppression, prejudice, and limiting labels, so the cultural or social things that inhibit us and disconnect us and alienate us, right? To use some of Greenleaf's terminology. And lastly, poverty, the material and economic dimensions that really prevent us from living a whole and truly human life, okay? In a modern context, poverty is to be understood through social science and have specific causes, and those causes that can and must be addressed. Theologically, poverty is death, it's sin, it's the negation of God's love. It is the opposite of that. And when you start preaching that message, there's a real urgency to that. There's a real power to here and now. And to some people, that's very threatening. And to some people, that's very empowering. To kind of sum up Father Gutierrez, there's two quotes I took from a book that's a compilation of his that I think ties in what we're trying to communicate in servant leadership in general very well. And that's that as a pastor, teacher, and theologian, he demonstrates that being bound, right, to God and others in the final analysis means being freed. Freed from self-centered existence, freed for loving service. That's a paraphrase of our servant leadership definition, if we've ever heard one, right? And lastly, to give you an idea of like how this is calling the church and the world to look at things differently, in summation, Gutierrez finds a new kind of society. It's characterized by justice, a new kind of human being that is characterized by other-centeredness, and a new kind of Christian disciple for whom justice is an absolute requirement of one's faith. So there's an urgency to it and a necessity to it. It cannot be separated. In fact, one epistle, there's a famous quote from On Human Work, and it's just that love is made concrete in justice, right? So all of that coming into being with those who that should be whose faith in God leads them to fight for freedom and justice, and that is for a human life. So the power of this is it's starting to claim more of what it means to be a human life, and it starts to really touch on all the things that encompass what a human life is. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Jenna, and she is going to lead us into the particular ways in which this has a prophetic flair to it.
Okay, so Will kind of gave you guys a really great overview of liberation theology. And then what I'm going to do, hopefully, is the synthesis piece. So by the time I'm done chit-chatting with you, hopefully I'll have given you three things. One is what is prophetic about liberation theology? Like, why is this something new that fits the criteria that we're talking about? How it plays out, how the historical reality of the movement serves as a prophetic call in the world of the church, and how the historical reality of the movement served as a prophetic call in the reality of the world. So I really like this topic, and I got really excited and wrote down way too much. So I'm going to try to tailor it down as we go. Bear with me a little bit. And I'm a little more stage shy than Will, so I'm just going to sit here. So we were talking before about how being prophetic involves a rebinding into wholeness. So what liberation theology does is it looks at what prevents that wholeness and then sees what needs to be done in terms of bringing it back together. Liberation theology looks at the suffering of the poor as a sign of the times, And then it takes seriously the question that's posed by Sabrino. What to do with the horror that history produces victims and that God seems impotent or at least inactive in dealing with the victimizers. And this can be a real stopping question for people, for church, for theology. It's just the idea that there's bullies and God doesn't care. So what's prophetic and what's different about what liberation theology does is liberation theology answers the question by finding God in, among, and for the oppressed. So normally when we're talking about God, I remember when I was really little, I used to envision God as this floating bust of Caesar that would rock back and forth my field of vision when I was praying. It was just the idea of this really big, important, and kind of far away and stone kind of God. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's kind of the image that we deal with a lot. It's the high and mighty God. But what liberation theology does is focusing on the God who is weak, the God who is vulnerable, the God who is with and of the poor. And this is a very new and slightly distasteful view of God if you're into a lot of choirs of angels and bright lights and stuff like that, because it's a very humble view of God. So the first reason why the content is prophetic is because Jesus is identified in and with the oppressed. Jesus spends most of his time with the outcasts. He ministers directly to the marginalized and the victims in his society. He spends time with tax collectors, with prostitutes. And so it's a statement about God is in relationship with the lowly and the outcast. Jesus himself could be considered marginalized. He was born in a barn. That's not a really noble beginning. He was relatively non-educated, and he was born in what his society would have considered illegitimate circumstances. So that doesn't give you a lot of station to begin with. But most importantly is the idea of the cross. Jesus was crucified. And if you're telling a hero story, it's not a really good ending to have your hero killed on a cross. And it's not just that he was killed, it's that crucifixion in the day was a very political repercussion. Not anyone could be crucified. You had to be punished by the government at the time. And so it's not just that Jesus was silenced, but he was put to death for being too radical, too revolutionary. Ernesto Cardenal was a poet, like Will was saying, and he has a line in one of his poems that says, "Pilate stuck up the sign in 4 languages, subversive." And on the cross, we see God as victim, as vulnerable, and oppressed. God is the ultimate outcast. And in that moment, Jesus says, "Why have you abandoned me?" There's this feeling of being scared, of being alone, and that's not really what you think of when you think of divinity. And so it's this moment of realizing that God is in relationship with victims because God experiences victimization. But the story doesn't end there. What's actually pretty cool, if we take out that little thing that Will was talking about before, the hermeneutic tool, is that back in the day, the line, "Why have you abandoned me?" comes from Psalm 22. And back in the day, if you didn't have time to say the whole psalm, you could just say the first verse and it would count as the whole thing. And so Psalm 22 is really a poem about radical trust, even a psalm about radical trust, even though it starts out kind of shaky. It's I feel like you've abandoned me, but I know that you're still there. And so it's the idea that even in the darkest hour, Jesus doesn't feel God's presence, but know God's there. And it's the idea that God is with Jesus on the cross, that God, in God's strength and God's glory, submits God's self to persecution, to victimization, to pain and suffering, and so transforms it. So God is with the poor. God is not ignoring the poor in the midst of their suffering. But that's not the final statement. The final statement is the resurrection. God transforms the lives of the poor. Resurrection was God's answer to death. And so it was a statement about new life, not just back to life, kind of like one of those, press rewind buttons. But it's the idea of a new and a more full life. And so that's what God did with Jesus as God's statement to Jesus' death. But what Sabrino says is to bear in mind that the cross of Jesus, before being the cross, was a cross, and that there have been many more before and after it. So there's a connection between what God does for Jesus and what God does for everyone who suffers, because Jesus wasn't the only one to suffer, and God recognizes that, and God is with those who suffer. So therefore, resurrection is God's response to Jesus' victimization and God's response to all victimization. Sabrino says there is a correlation between resurrection and victims. The hope of the resurrection applies directly to justice, not simply to survival. Its primary subjects are victims, not simply human beings. Its scandal it has to overcome is death inflicted unjustly, not simple natural death of our destiny. The hope that the resurrection rebuilds now is not just any hope, but hope in the power of God over the injustice that produces victims. So resurrection is new life for the poor and the oppressed, and it's a statement that God acts out for victims and the outcast. Another reason why the content of liberation theology is prophetic is exactly what Will was saying, the preferential option for the poor. Now, preferential option for the poor doesn't mean that God's pretty much saying, like, peace out if you're lower middle class and above, that God's only concerned with the poor. The preferential option for the poor says that God loves everyone, and God loves life everywhere it exists, but is most concerned with life where it's vulnerable. So Gutierrez has a quote that says, "Preference implies the universality of God's love, which excludes no one. It is only within the framework of this universality that we can understand the preference, that is, what comes first." So it's not a question of who's most important, it's a question of who deserves the most attention at the moment in order to survive so that everyone can have a full life. And what that results in is a power shift, because it's a reworking of the question of who gets attention in the center of a society. So what's on the outside and the marginalized gets put to the inside, because every question you ask is the question of how is this going to affect the poor. But then if you're moving folks to the inside, the reverse of that is that you're moving folks who used to be on the inside a little more to the sides. So there's a reshifting going on. Yes, that's what I have to say on that. The next reason why the content is prophetic is because not only is God identified with the victims, and not only are the victims put in the center of society, but then there's a whole movement that goes along with it, where the gospel says, hey, if this is something that you're into, then it's something you need to act on. And it calls people to a public, to a political, and to a prophetic life. And so there's the idea of a movement involved. And this culminates in the call of the church to be on the side of the poor. So there's a recognition that in following the gospel, the church is called to continue the work of the gospel. So the church now has to become a very public voice. The church is involved now in politics. There's a line in Jeremiah that says, "To know God is to do justice," and that becomes the new mission of the church. So this results in a shift of focus in the church's attention. It's not just the people in the pews that the church is ministering to now, but first and foremost, the church is ministering to the poor wherever they may be, even if they're not in the pews. There's a quote that says, "The delaying of the breaking of Eucharistic bread sometimes must be done until the hungry have been given real bread." And that's a really, really radical and decentering statement, because what it's talking about is Eucharist. Now, theologically, Eucharist is really bound up in service and commitment and life lived with the poor. So theologically, this isn't like groundbreaking. But sacramentally, the Eucharist is the heart of the church life. And so for someone to say, we're going to hold off on the Eucharistic bread and start dealing with like real bread is a huge, huge change in conversation. So in practice, it's calling for a radical and what some would think flat out wrong shift in the work and the purpose of the church. And that plays out in really real and concrete ways, especially in Latin America. The historical experience of liberation theology as a movement was hugely, hugely prophetic in Latin America and really shook up the groundwork for all people involved and the way that the church began to understand its role from that point forward. That's because liberation theology challenged the authenticity of the church. Romero says that there is no neutral ground here. Either we serve in the lives of Salvadorans or we are accomplices in their death. And we are here, we have the historical mediation of the very heart of our faith. Either we believe in a God of life or we serve the idols of death. And then Fernando Cardenal put it just a little more succinctly. In Medellin, among the poor, I came to understand that God isn't neutral, and I swore to live for their liberation. So basically, in saying that God isn't neutral, it's drawing a line in the sand. God isn't on both sides. God belongs to one side, and God belongs on the side of the poor. And so if the church isn't siding with the poor, the church is against God in what Cardinal says. And that's like a huge, huge throwing down of a glove and a challenge right there. Liberation theology also challenges the attention of the church. The ministry of the church is not just the people in the pews again, but first and foremost the poor wherever they are. But in order to emphasize this new ministry to the poor, which is really nothing more than a return to the oldest and deepest ministry of the church, you need to start de-emphasizing some of the things the church was currently focusing on. And so there's a challenge in there that says, like, hey, what are we doing with our resources and our time, and what are we saying from the pulpit that is really intersecting with the lives of the poor? So if we look at like the Villanova church, and it's all marble and it's beautiful, there's also a question in there about the reallocation of those resources, though. Sometimes we need to turn our attention away from that in order to provide immediate things to the people who need them. So sometimes it's called giving up the smells and bells of Catholicism in order to be truly Catholic. Can I borrow this for a second? Thanks. Liberation theology also challenges the authority of the church because Ernesto Cardenal, Fernando Cardenal, and 3 other priests actually served in governmental roles in the Sandinista government. And so at that point, you have people who are reporting to like a church authority being the same people who are reporting to a political authority. And then when church and state come into conflict, you have people who need to start negotiating a way to answer those questions. And in that sense, it was seen as a challenge to the authority of the church and who becomes first and foremost. And so, let me just check something. All right. So therefore, in putting all these countercultural ideas out there, the obvious response is going to be one of conflict. And that was what met a lot of these prominent voices. Fernando and Ernesto Cardenal, along with the 3 other priests who were serving the Sandinista government, were challenged by Rome and asked to step down. And there was like a series of letters that went back and forth in which the priests really collectively thought about how they saw being political and fulfilling their duties as one and the same, being political and fulfilling their duties to church as one and the same. So they issued this really beautiful letter that was a profession of their faith about how they're very committed to what they understand the gospel to be, and the best way that they can live this gospel commitment out is by serving the people through political change. And then in the period following that, Rome actually removed their faculties of the priesthood. So they didn't formally kick them out, but for the time that they served in government, they could no longer practice as a priest. Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology, also caught a lot of flack in the area that he was serving, and so he became a Dominican in order to be shielded from some of the local or ordinary priests and pressure. Sobrino, because of the theological positions he took in his works, was the subject of theological critique and a statement of admonishment issued by the Vatican and the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith in 2007. They said that Sobrino's works contain propositions which are either erroneous or dangerous and may cause harm to the faithful because of the emphasis that he put on Christ's humanity as opposed to over and against his divinity. His own bishop, Archbishop Fernando Sáenz Lacal, who is the Archbishop of San Salvador, said that Sobrino may not teach theology or lecture in his archdiocese, which includes the UCA, the University of Central America. And so Sobrino was silenced in his own university. And the kicker is that in their notification, the congregation emphasized that the reason why they silenced him was part of their service to the people of God, and particularly to the simple and poorest members of the church. And finally, we're going to look really quickly at the prophetic impact of the liberation theology movement in the world at the time as well. So Basically, at the time, in countries where governments couldn't provide adequate support for their people, the church stepped in to provide social services. So when the church is speaking out on the side of the poor, it's also a political condemnation of the government of a country and a threat to their power base, because it's saying we're taking care of what you're failing to take care of, and it's pointing out weaknesses. On top of it, it's also very countercultural because it's pushing revolution in favor of the poor. So it's flipping the power base of society in general. But on top of it, it's asking for concrete action supporting this. There's a really strong relationship between a gospel concern for the poor and the demand that it be translated into concrete actions, policies, political agendas. And so now the church is taking on a political platform in the area, which is becoming very threatening. The church is also now having people who are stationed in the government, and so it's seen as a subversive tool, whereas the government governments in the countries at the time had basically relied on the church to give moral direction for the salvation of souls. Now the church is mucking around in who has control, who has power, and the very foundation of these governments' bases, and that's something that's really, really threatening. Bishops begin to speak out in ways that are critical of the government, which is threatening for a government if it's new and trying to establish itself after a revolution, or if it's unstable in the midst of a revolution. And finally, just even the movement of these revolutions is something that starts to receive a lot of criticism. It's the idea of just turning to war and destabilizing as a way of solving conflict instead of working towards things that create a prolonged peace. And so this also gets met with a conflict-ridden response from the world of political power as well. On March 24th, 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero was shot while giving a mass, a month after publicly asking the United States government to stop military aid to the Salvadoran government, and a day after he called upon members of the Salvadorian soldiers and security force members not to follow orders of their commanders to kill Salvadorian civilians, especially farm workers. Afterwards, in November of 1980, was the killing of the 4 women religious that we were talking about earlier. On the closing liturgy on December 1st, Ida Ford read a passage from one of Archbishop Oscar Romero's final homilies, saying, "Christ invites us not to fear persecution because, believe me, brothers and sisters, the one who is committed to the poor must run the same fate as the poor. And in El Salvador, we know that the fate of the poor signifies to disappear, to be tortured, to be held captive, and to be found dead." The following day, she and one other sister boarded a plane to return to El Salvador. They were picked up by missionaries Dorothy Kazel and Jean Donovan, and several members of the National Guard stopped the vehicle that they were traveling in. They were then tortured, raped, killed, and their bodies were dumped in an unmarked grave. Finally, in 1989, there was the massacre of the scholars of the UCA. This is a situation in which 6 priests, Jesuits, who were very outspoken. Sabrina was supposed to be among one of them, but he happened to just be out of the area at the time, were killed along with their housekeeper and her daughter by a task force in the Salvadorian army. On the one hand, it increased international pressure on the Salvadorian government to sign peace agreements. On the other hand, though, it also helped to make their ideas become known worldwide. And so that's kind of like the final rallying cry of all of this, that in the middle of conflict, there's still a way of a message carrying on. There's a quote that says, "Within days of the murders of the Jesuits, hundreds of Jesuits all over the world were volunteering to take the places of the 6 martyrs. That is the beginning of a resurrection. The response to the killings was supposed to be, they killed Jesus for speaking out, therefore we better not speak out, or we will be killed also. But the actual result of the killing was, they killed Jesus for speaking out, therefore we must speak out for them." And so in this, you see the movement of the prophetic, becoming a voice for the voiceless, and the idea that the message lives on. So what is the legacy of liberation theology? In a very concrete and practical way, the liberation theology that came out of Latin America led to a lot of other liberation theology movements that were taking off in places around the world. The most notable being James Cone and his work with Black liberation theology. Also, there was the Mujerista movement, which was looking at liberation theology from the experience of being a woman and being Latina. There's also Filipino liberation theology movements. The values that transcend and that continue to inform the way we think about social justice work today is the idea of compromiso. Even though it sounds like compromise, what it really means is commitment, and commitment until the end. A conviction and hope that there is a way of imagining a world other than the way it is now, and that transformation can actually occur. The conviction in God's presence, that God isn't impartial to what's going on, but that God is active and in league with the oppressed. The preferential option for the poor, that is the most vulnerable in our society, that determine our next several steps. And finally, the idea of Oscar Romero. We'll leave you with the final quote. He says that I will live on in the people, or I will rise again in the people. So it's the idea of the movement and the call being continued on and being realized not in any one leader or any one movement, but in the realization of the rebinding of society.